Thank you, Sarah, for doing a reprise of the Ethnobotany Lecture for everyone online. Really appreciate the time and effort to do this, but I think everyone will enjoy this lecture, those who missed it last week. So please, thanks again for coming.
Well, thank you, Raj, and thank you, Raj, for re-recording the lecture so that other people can listen in. And also, I'd like to say thank you for being invited in the first place to give the talk at Kew and for Kent. As somebody who started their career at Kew as a 21-year-old botany graduate, it was really very humbling to be asked to come and give the lecture. So I feel amazed actually, given that I had sat in the Distinguished Ethnobotanist lectures over the years since they first started and attended most of them, to actually be standing up in front of everyone and delivering a lecture myself was wonderful. So I started my career, as I said, at Kew as a 21-year-old working in the computer unit, so not actually working in ethnobotany. So this presentation today really is about my journey in becoming an ethnobotanist and why ethnobotany is so wonderful, and really we want everyone to be an ethnobotanist. So on that note, before I start, I must actually as well say that the knowledge, any traditional knowledge presented here, remains the intellectual property of the traditional knowledge holders. And also that some of the images depict colleagues and relatives of First Nations heritage who have since passed, since the photos were taken, which may cause distress to anybody who's watching that may be of First Nations heritage. And on that note, I will begin. Well, first of all, the first question really to address is what is ethnobotany? Because while most people watching this video will probably know what ethnobotany is, not everyone will. So ethnobotany was a discipline, was only first identified as a separate subject in the end of the 19th century by an American botanist, John Harshberger, who used the term to really talk about, from an anthropological point of view, sort of concerned with identifying plants of useful use, utilitarian use, and also those that have potential economic value. The first ethnobotanists were really concerned with really understanding plants that had a use, but from an etic perspective. So they were documenting uses from this outsider's or the researcher's perspective, rather than really being very interested in local people's understanding of the plants themselves. Ethnobotany has really developed as a discipline since the end of the 19th century, and there have been papers written about the different phases of the subject, which have been, as the discipline has evolved, which each phase has had a particular academic focus. So today, ethnobotany can really be understood as the discipline that studies the dynamic interactions and interrelationships between people and plants as mediated through culture. And ethnobotany, one of the main attributes of ethnobotany is its interdisciplinarity. It's a field that uses techniques and methodologies from across both the natural sciences and social sciences, including biology, anthropology, ethnography, phytochemistry, all sorts of areas that are brought together under this one umbrella discipline. And another aspect of ethnobotany, which I think really needs to be sort of shouted from the rooftops, is that it's a bridge between different knowledge systems. And because of this, it can offer insights which I believe can help address the current ecological crises. And I'll start off by showing this map, which I think really highlights why we need to study plant knowledge in relation to the cultures where they are found. So this is a map that shows a correlation between linguistic diversity and plant diversity. And you can see on a broad global scale, there's a very strong correlation between areas of high linguistic diversity and high plant diversity. And you can use languages as a proxy for cultures. So these areas, you can see there's something going on. Why would it be that you have this correlation? Well, there's certainly number of hypotheses put forward. You can see that some of these regions happen to be mountainous areas, island groups. So the factors that create plant diversity are also probably going to have an impact on cultures, such as isolation, adaptation. So some of those processes that apply to plants are also applying to people's cultures. But we are facing a huge loss of biodiversity. As we know, some scientists have said that we're about to enter a 6th mass extinction that hasn't been seen since the end of the Cretaceous period, when dinosaurs went extinct. But we're also losing languages. So it's really important to understand that, when we lose a language, which is essential to the human heritage, every language embodies the unique cultural wisdom of a people. So the loss of any language is thus a loss for all humanity. So languages shape how we see the world, and they also are probably shaped by the world as well. So there's a parallel extinction risk to species and languages. From the latest Kew State of the World's Plants and Fungi report, 77% of undescribed vascular plants are threatened with extinction, and 45% of known flowering plants are estimated to be threatened. So it's a really huge loss that we're currently facing. But I've done it again. I'm sorry, I have to try and go back. Here we go. Simultaneously, we are losing many languages. It's predicted that 50 to 90% of the world's 7,400 languages will be extinct by the end of this century. And in Australia in particular, where I spent a lot of my field work, working with First Nations communities, before the arrival of Europeans, it was known that there were more than 250 languages that was spoken, and language experts believe that more languages have been lost from Australia than anywhere else on the planet. So there is an inextricable link between cultural, linguistic, and biological diversity. So this is why you need this holistic approach of ethnobotany to understand all three together. And for First Nations or Indigenous peoples, who represent 5% of the global human population, they are the stewards of 80% of the world's biodiversity. So, I mean, really, we need to be looking after Indigenous First Nations people's cultures, because they are the stewards of most of the planet's plants and animals and fungi. And what's really important is understanding traditional ecological knowledge, because this knowledge and practices are what helps maintain biodiversity in these places where Indigenous peoples live. And today, many ethnobotanists are active in decolonisation. We work in collaboratively and equitably with local peoples to help conserve biocultural diversity. We need to conserve the whole culture, languages, and biological diversity combined. I also wanted to talk a little bit about how First Nations peoples and Indigenous peoples often view themselves in the world, because this is really key to this understanding and why probably they're such good stewards of the environment. The term concentric ecology was used first coined by a Native American ethnobotanist called Henrique Salmon in 2000. And it's really talking about, in his paper, how Indigenous peoples across the world perceive themselves as part of this extended kinship network. We're related to all other living beings, plants, animals, fungi. And actually, biologists hypothesize the same. It may be billions of years ago, but we all share a common ancestor. There's also something to remember, is that many First Nations peoples or Aboriginal peoples have a very complex totemic kinship system, which is based on reciprocity. So it's not about seeing yourself as above another species. It's about being in a reciprocal relationship. And also the sentience and personhood of other living beings is acknowledged. Now, this is something that scientists would have balked at, I think, maybe, 20 or so years ago. But with the work of Suzanne Simard, we're now realizing that actually, plants, for example, recognize kin. They demonstrate a form of intelligence that we would not have believed, 50 or so years ago. And I was told by a First Nations elder in Australia, who was pointing at this rather large tree, and he said, "See that tree over there? That tree, same as you and me." So I'm going to start with the dreaming, because in the beginning was the dreaming. And to First Nations peoples, the dreaming or dream time is a sacred narrative. This is First Nations peoples in Australia, obviously, a sacred narrative of the creation of the world, as the Aboriginal people know and understand it. So across Australia, First Nations peoples tells of these ancestral beings who were the initial creative forces that emerged from the ground and shaped the landforms, the rivers, the waterholes, the rocks and the mountains that are seen today. And these totemic beings wandered over the continent, singing out the name of everything that crossed their path, and they sang the world into existence, creating the important sacred sites, the so-called story places, where animals and plants are created, as well as people, Aboriginal law, and the totemic connections between them all. And these epic journeys, the ancestral beings took across the continent and recorded and marked as songlines. So this is a rock painting from a Biri rock in the Northern Territory. And this shows the rainbow serpent, who is a very well-known deity in First Nations cosmology. And First Nations peoples in Australia are the oldest continuous culture on Earth. Archaeological evidence, recent archaeological evidence has indicated that the peoples of Australia, who the First Nations peoples arrived on the continent more than 60,000 years ago, crossing by land bridge from Indonesia. And there's been evidence from archaeologists who are working in the Northern Territory, for example, who've uncovered evidence of plant use, of these plants that are still used today. Absolutely incredible. So my story in Australia also began with a dream. And in my dream, I actually had a lucid dream. I was working at Kew at the time, and it was a really powerful dream. And I dreamt that I was being led through the Australian outback, the bush, with a deep red earth, and this very old Aboriginal man who was wrapped in bark, was showing me the landforms. He was showing me the plants and the animals, and he was communicating with me in his own language. And although I couldn't understand the words themselves, I understood what he was trying to convey. He was showing me this beautiful country. And it was such a profound and vivid lucid dream. I was conscious that I was dreaming, that when I woke up the next day, I thought I had to go to Australia. It was really important that I must go to Australia. And I wanted to follow my dream of becoming an ethnobotanist, having attended all the lectures at Kew where other ethnobotanists had given their lectures on their work in other places around the world. So the next day I asked my line manager at Kew, and I was given permission with the then director of Kew, Professor Sir Gillian Prance, who actually encouraged my pursuit in ethnobotany and lent me his own books on the subject. So I wrote to people in Australia offering my services for a year, and I was luckily offered the opportunity to work with the Plants and Wildlife Commission of the Northern Territory, working as a field assistant to Glenn Whiteman, who had been working with many First Nations communities across the north. And the first project I was involved with was with the Tiwi ethnobiology project. So I worked very closely with the elders from Melville Island, which is about 80 kilometres off the north coast of Darwin. And the first day I went out with the elders, we went out sort of looking at some of the plants. You can see here, we've got on the left here, Lydia Burak, who is pulling the edge off the pandanus to be able to use it to weave to make into dilly bags or a skirt. In the center, middle top, you have Anita with her with a bush almond, and which is one of the bush foods that people traditionally eat. And on the right, Lydia here is showing asparagus racemosus, which is used in traditional medicine. But my first journey with these elders, we went out and they went and collected some mud crabs and cooked them on the fire and presented with me on the leaf for me to eat for lunch. Now, I was faced a really huge dilemma at this point because I had been vegan for some number of years, and at the same time, I didn't wish to offend these lovely people who had very kindly shared their meal with me. And so rather than, I really faced this dilemma. And at this time, I just thought, I'm just going to be honest. And I expressed my gratitude and said that while I found that, it was really beautiful, and like they have a totem animal that is sacred, that they cannot eat. All animals are sacred to me. And so I don't eat any animals. And they were really quite taken aback. And Anita said to me, "You have such a hard law. I cry for you for sticking to such a hard law." And I then played my violin for her, took my fiddle with me, because I wanted to sort of apologize, really. So I shared my music, and they adopted me. She adopted me as her own daughter. I was given a skin name, and I became part of the kinship system. So it was an honor to be accepted into the family. And it actually meant that I was able to record the knowledge about the plants because I was part of the family. One of the plants that we collected was cheeky yam. So cheeky in Aboriginal English doesn't mean the same as in UK English. Cheeky implies something could be a bit dangerous. For example, a cheeky crocodile that came up to the camp and ate a couple of dogs one night he was called Cheeky. Amorphophallus glabra is this yam, which is associated with ceremonies. The tubers are harvested very early in the dry season when above ground stems have turned yellow. It's quite toxic, so it has to be cooked very well. It's cooked in ashes and coals and cooked from sunset to sunrise. And it's eaten on the first night of the Kalama ceremony, which is a significant event in the ceremonial calendar of the Tiwi people. And this ceremony is all centered around male initiation and a composition of the songs that are written by the senior men. And the ceremony begins on the first full moon after beginning of the dry season. And firing of the bush can only begin after the ceremony. And when I talk about firing of the bush, the use of fire is really important in shaping the Australian landscape. And while I was working in the Parks and Wildlife Commission of the Northern Territory, I was also involved in a bushfire regeneration survey project. So before I go on, there's just the outcome of the work working with the Tiwi. A book was produced for use in the communities of Melville Island and Bathurst Island, where the Tiwi people live. Beautiful photographs, and it has the traditional knowledge. So it enables sort of intergenerational transmission of knowledge. So this book is available in the schools and the local communities. So caring for country is a term that I came across quite a lot. People would talk about, First Nations people in Australia often talk about caring for country because it's really important you have a duty. Traditional owners, as they're called, do not own the land. They are owned by the land. It's where they belong to. And they have a duty during their lifetime to care for the land. And traditional burning regimes have been used for thousands of years and have helped shape the Australian landscape. And from scientific studies, looking at the sort of mosaic pattern of burning that would have been traditionally undertaking, it actually promotes biodiversity. So many sort of people of European descent think of the Australian bushfires as being really, really dangerous. But actually, if they're managed carefully, such as these traditional regimes that are still carried out in the northern part of the country, it actually promotes biodiversity and they're not destructive. People talk about a cool burn. So the grasses and the lower herbaceous levels, lower vegetation is burnt, very light burn, which doesn't affect the tree, it doesn't kill the trees. It removes the dead grass. So it means that when you get the wildfires, when the lightning strikes begin at the beginning of the wet season, you don't get these dangerous, hazardous fires that have been seen elsewhere in Australia. And one of the issues around the really hazardous and bushfires that have been seen in recent years in parts of Australia is probably partly caused by the fact that these traditional management practices are no longer being carried out in these areas. So people have a really good in-depth knowledge of how to set fire, when to do so, where to do so. And it's really important that this traditional ecological knowledge is kept. And the use of fire has also been carried out traditionally in North America, for example. And when Yosemite National Park was created and the Native American peoples who lived there were evicted, the fires were no longer, the traditional fires were no no longer being undertaken, and it resulted in loss of biodiversity. So this bushfire regeneration survey, so I was involved with in Kakadu. We had to look at the different grass species according to different burning plots. And you can see me here on a quad bike. I was given the task actually of setting fire to the bush with the local rangers, which was actually great fun. And I didn't realize how much fun it could be. But what people believe, it doesn't really cause harm because it's a very cool, slow moving fire. The animals move out of the way. It just removes the dead grass and it allows the fresh shoots to grow. So, and there's been a lot of evidence to show that many of the species in Australia have co-evolved with fire. So they actually need fire to propagate and germinate. When I came back to Kew after my year's sabbatical working in Australia, I carried on working in the computer unit, developing collections management and taxonomic databases. But after a year, I thought I really wanted to continue my pursuit in becoming an ethnobotanist. And so at that time, there were no ethnobotany degree courses. It was a year before the MSc in ethnobotany got off the ground at Kent. I realised I needed to study social sciences. I'd come from a science background with botany, but I needed the social sciences. And so I applied to UCL and was accepted on the course, the MSc in medical anthropology, because I was particularly interested in medicinal plants. It's something I've always been interested in, even since I was a child, when I volunteered in a physic garden of a stately manor house in Rickmansworth called Cheney's. Part of my degree, my MSc course, I went to do some field work in northeast Brazil, and through connections from colleagues at Kew, I was to work with Professor Matos, who was a phytochemist and an ethnobotanist, who was instrumental in setting up this living pharmacies project, this Farmácias Vivas do Ceará. And he was based at the Universidade Federal do Ceará. And the aim of the project was to provide safe and effective herbal medicines to local people. So they established these medicinal plant gardens where plants were grown correctly in a way to address any conservation issues. They're grown in these medicinal gardens, and they were manufactured into products by local people to create income in the favelas, in the comunidades. And also that the project established one of the only germplasm banks of medicinal plants in Brazil. Professor Matos also developed a database of scientific studies on regional medicinal plants. And as a result of his work, Professor Matos' idea was actually used as a template for other states in Brazil, because people realized, the rich culture of Brazil, the use of medicinal plants is really helpful in helping to meet primary healthcare needs. So in the Farmácias Vivas project, you see here a picture of some women working in the lab. They were producing standardized herbal medicines, and they were for use in these comunidades of Fortaleza. The project is now national, and as acknowledgement and homage to Professor Matos, 21st of May, which was his birthday, is now known in Brazil as Medicinal Plant Day. So the plants grown in the living pharmacies, they were tested for their clinical effectiveness and to make sure they weren't toxic, and only safe species were encouraged for use. Now, Professor Matos expressed his frustration to me when I was working there, that why, he's trying to educate local people to only use safe medicinal plants, not those that can cause harm. But there was when I undertook a survey of the medicinal plants that were being sold in the local market stalls in both Recife and Fortaleza in the northeast of Brazil, there were a number of highly toxic and potentially lethal plants that could be bought from these vendors. Although the market stall vendors did stress their danger, they did know those which were toxic. But it's trying to understand, why were people using this? And when you understand the belief that sickness should be purged from the body, that's why many of the plants that were used would induce vomiting, or they were laxatives, they were quite toxic because they were purgatives. But also, some of the plants that were used to treat what's known as delayed or suspended menstruation. So a way of women taking control over their bodies and their fertility, essentially. So a sort of perhaps euphemistic way of removing an unwanted baby, where abortions are illegal in the country. And the majority of the plants sold in the markets, which is interesting, were of European or West African origin, sort of reflecting the local people's ethnic heritage, which obviously in Brazil is a legacy of colonialism from Portugal, and also the slave trade. So it's really, well, as we look at herbal medicines as well, understanding the context of use is really important. So this is a picture of a curandeira, Dr. Raiz, Dr. Root from Fortaleza, and he's showing you his picture here of his spirit guide. So he used both spiritual healing as long with the plant medicines that he prescribed. And it's really important to understand that actually there are these aspects of use that are likely to elicit a physiological response, as well as any materiality of the pharmacological activities of a plant, as well as the phytochemistry. It's also how people's psychological reaction to it, the meaning response that's being elicited. So the clinical effectiveness is affected by the context of use, which adds to the therapeutic effects of the plant extract. After my MSc in anthropology, I fell into sort of doing freelance work, and I was back working at Kew on a Chinese medicine project when I received an email out of the blue asking if I would like to work with the Wik, Wikwa and Kugu people, collectively known as the Wik, in far north Queensland in a community called Erakoon. And I jumped at the chance. Obviously, this would be a great opportunity for me. And I set about trying to get funding. And I was very lucky that I was able to get funding for a 3-month pilot project, which led to me being given a scholarship at School of Pharmacy, London School of Pharmacy, now part of UCL, to undertake a PhD research project. So I wasn't particularly trying to do a PhD, but I wanted to legitimize my position to be able to go and work in Australia with visas, etc. It was quite a rational choice to be able to do as a PhD project, and I was very glad that I did. So in this picture here, you can see in the background, this was taken at a Land and Health Summit rather, that was attended by the then Prime Minister, John Howard. And you may notice that the women are holding these leaves. Now, these are leaves from the ironwood tree, Erythrophleum chlorostachys, I believe, and that it is burnt to, as like Native Americans have smudging plants, it's burnt to remove negative spirits. And quite amusingly, these were being wafted quite a lot over the head of John Howard, the Prime Minister, to remove his negative spirits. So one of the quotes I took when I arrived in Erakoon was, "My parents taught me the name of every tree, every plant, every fish. In 20 years, this will all be forgotten. Young people today prefer to live in the busy world." So 20 years has gone on since then, but hopefully as a result of the project, this knowledge hasn't been lost. So, but this lament, this concern that the elders had, that the younger generation weren't interested in anymore in their culture, or they were losing their culture, was what was the instrumental in them inviting me to come and work with the community to develop a database for use in the community and to document the traditional knowledge. So before I begin on the story of working with the Wik, you can see here this cousin Jubilee, who's since passed away, and he worked on a project to produce a traditional outrigger canoe, which was great fun. We worked very closely with the local school, and so they were involved in the process so they could learn how to build these traditional boats, these traditional canoes. But amusingly, my PhD supervisor, Professor Michael Heinrich at the School of Pharmacy, said about my project, he said, I don't really mind what you do, what you focus on, but we're not interested in boats. And of course, that ended up being one of the first little projects within the project that I was involved with. So Erakoon itself was established as a mission in 1904 by German Moravian missionaries, but most of the local First Nations peoples stayed away from the mission until about the 1950s. And they believe that this enabled them to keep their culture strong. The current population of Erakoon is roughly 1,300 people, And there are a number of language groups who belong to the community, who make up the Wik-Wik-Wa Kugu peoples, and 5 spirit clans, Putch, Appalach, Wanam, Winchenham, and Sara. People self-identify according to their totemic affiliations, and particularly they identify according to whether their top end, in other words, whether their ancestors came from the eucalypt forest or timber country, as they call it, or the bottom end or the coastal area. And the Wik-Munken is one of the language groups, and it's also the name of the local lingua franca. And this is a map to show you where Aurukun is, and you can see here it's on the west coast of Cape York Peninsula on the Gulf of Carpentaria. In the dry season, it's about a 12-hour drive from Cairns along the development road, which is in most of the places it's a dirt track. And in the wet season, it actually gets cut off by road. The middle map shows you Aurukun Shire and all the different types of vegetation. So it's very rich in biodiversity. So as well as vast expanse of eucalyptus forest, there's also mangrove swamp, there's riverine rainforest areas, melaleuca, the tea trees, and freshwater lagoons, and also the saltwater areas on the coast too. On the right is a picture showing a mining lease area. So while the Wik people were able to get their native title recognised very early on, and so that gives them rights of ownership to their land, traditional land, mining leases predate their native title. So they have legal precedence. And there's a Glencore bauxite mine, which is about to begin excavating very soon, shortly if it has not already. But you can see the area of the mining lease is actually quite large, a large part of Aurukun Shire. Now, people have a very mixed view of the mine, because the people whose traditional country it is are very concerned, some of them, because health is associated with country, health and land are interlinked. And if you can't live in country anymore, then there's a fear that you'll get sick. At the same time, people think, well, it could provide employment opportunities, like real work opportunities, and give people, maybe enable people to have access to vehicles, to get access to their clan estates. So it's not one view of the mine. There's a very mixed perception of it. But Ark is the Wik-Munken name for country. And to the Wik people, Ark, or country, is the physical embodiment of the sacred. So people believe it's where your spirit emanates from and where you return to at point of death. And this is a photo on the beautiful places I went to while I was in my fieldwork, one of the water lily lagoons. And the water lily is actually the emblem of Aurukun. I was told it's important to talk to people who might help our own country. So ancestors who are watching can send thoughts and help him with words to say. So today I'm talking as a delegate of the traditional owners, and while we're not on country itself, I'll be showing you the pictures of country, and hopefully I will do the ancestors proud by speaking correctly. So the project I was involved with was very much around participation. It's a participatory research project. I worked with on country with the local rangers from Aurukun and the traditional owners who directed the project. And although I got funding to do a PhD, I didn't start off with a scientific framework, but I developed it around local people's priorities, and the outcomes were agreed with the local people. So regularly I held workshops with the community, invited everyone to attend, where we could talk about what people wanted and what they wanted me to do, that I was offering my services, essentially working for the community. And there were 3 main priorities for the requested research. And these were in descending order: education. They were really, as I said before, the main concern was this loss of traditional knowledge that was being, younger members of the community were losing their traditional cultural knowledge. But health of people and environment, as I said before, they're intertwined, and sustainable development, looking at ways in which traditional knowledge could be used to maybe develop some little enterprises, such as its bush oil enterprises, which actually did occur. I was also to work very closely with the songman. This is a picture of the songman, Joe Nalamata, and his son, Joel. Now, Aboriginal songmen, First Nation songmen, are highly regarded. They're the special performers. They learn the songs and the sacred songs and dances that are handed down from the ancestors. And it's important that the songs are still sung as they keep the land and the beings that inhabit the land alive. And these songs and the songmen play a central role in ceremonies, which can last for several days or weeks, and historically even months. The ceremonies are enacted in specific places along the song lines to pass on respect to the ancestors at the creation sites, and also to initiate the next generation into sacred laws. So the Arakan songman was the principal knowledge custodian in the community, and I was to work very closely with him when I arrived, and he adopted me as his own daughter, which, as I said before, with the Tiwi people was a distinct honour. But it was also pragmatic, because there would not then be any issues around telling me about plants, potentially sacred knowledge, which was usually kept within clan or family groups. So he was my peep or father, and he was a Kuga Uwan man, and the last person alive in Arakan to been brought up traditionally as a hunter-gatherer, or practicing as a hunter-gatherer, gathering food. I know that term is actually contentious. I should probably say the last person to be brought up traditionally, living off the land in the bush. And he only came into Arakan, which was then a mission, as a 14-year-old boy, when his parents exchanged him for flour, sugar, tea, and tobacco, which may seem shocking to us today, but actually probably his parents were concerned for his safety, as there had been a number of horrible acts of genocide, with even whole Aboriginal groups like the Wikompen had been murdered and as acts of revenge when pastoralists are being killed. So it's probably as well to ensure his safety and that he was being looked after that he was brought into the mission. And Joe was also the last native speaker of Kuga Uwan. So most of the methodologies I use, anyone familiar with anthropology or even ethnobotany, participant observation. I was to live in the community, work alongside people. I attended ceremonies, camping trips. Some of these pictures are taken from, a couple of these pictures here are taken from a house opening ceremony. So when people believe that when they pass away, that their spirit still lingers for about a year, and it's really important that you don't attract the spirit and you don't call their names. Their name becomes tapich or taboo, and their clan estate becomes closed to outsiders, as does their house, if they their house in Arakan. And then after a period of time, usually about a year, a ceremony is held when the house is opened up again, and people celebrate with traditional dancing, singing, and feasting. And yeah, as you can see me here, I slept a lot under the stars out country and on clan estates, which was actually a really wonderful experience. It was important to collect herbarium voucher specimens. Now, the reason being because while documenting knowledge about the plants using the local language name is really important, names may change, names may be forgotten, and the identity of the plants from a scientific perspective is also really important. So, and even the taxonomy, the scientific nomenclature may change as well, as understanding in taxonomy may be updated when, for example, genetic analyses may uncover new taxa. Cultural information is often embedded within a name, so the common name is also the local name is also really important too. So it's important to have that physical record. And I lodged the plant with the local herbarium at James Cook University in far north Queensland, so that it would have access, so local people could have access to it. There is actually now an ethnobiology department where a lot of Indigenous peoples from Northern Australia are actually undertaking programs in the universities, which is really wonderful. Names are really important, and one of the other projects I worked on was a medicinal plant names project at Kew, which I can tell you all about another time, but names are really important because they do encode a meaning in them quite often. So as I said before, education was one of the main priorities, so worked very closely with the local Kulkan school students, and we worked with them, with the elders, so I was facilitating that sort of transference of knowledge. And really, it was really wonderful to see some of the students become really engaged with understanding about their own cultural heritage and having pride in their own cultural heritage. So one of the areas that was really important because of the link with health as well was looking into bush tucker or bush food. So you can see here Paranari Nonda, which is both a food and a medicine. My mark is on the bottom left, which is a lovely sweet fruit. And you often find these interesting food plants growing in the favoured campsites. And it's not because people intentionally cultivated them. It's literally because they were the campsites, you'd throw the pips or the stones away, and those plants were then more likely to grow in those areas. So the human activity is helping distribute these plant species in their favoured areas. The top right plant is my sticky Sterculia quadrifida, the bush peanut, and the bottom right is my chunk, which is a syzygium fruit. And in the middle, you can see, middle bottom, you can see a couple of yams. The ones on the left are the my wati, Dioscorea transversa, which is or was a staple food, and there are actually increased ceremonies that are held at Omban, its site of its story place. So I was told that plant food makes you healthy. In the old days, people lived to older age, not like now, people dying before their time. So as a result of colonialism and the changing lifestyle, there has been a massive nutritional transition. So people moved away from eating bush foods, and there's now a huge rise in type 2 diabetes amongst community members, which had probably been unheard of before Europeans arrived on the continent of Australia, probably would have been unknown. But now most of the people, older members of the community, once you reach, your 40s, it's very likely you'll have type 2 diabetes. And this is because of the move to the very highly processed refined carbohydrates that have been introduced. The traditional management practices maximize food production. Traditionally, people would move from favoured campsites according to the seasons to maximize access to food. And people recognize ownership of particular plants. So as I said before, the human activities promote the growth of the important food at the favoured campsites. One of the foods that was also used is also a plant that features in my book, the Ethnobotanical, which is arrowroot, Tachylionto petaloides. And like yams, it's valued for its starchy tubers, and it's an important food source for Pacific Island cultures, as well as the First Nation peoples of North Australia. But it contains quite toxic compounds, which requires a lot of processing to remove. So it may be soaked in water for several days and mashed. To the Fijians, they will put it in the ground to sort of ferment it before it's used. And it's also used in some amazing sounding dishes I haven't actually tried, but mixed with coconut and fruit, and but eaten as a food by Pacific Islanders in that way, as a special dish. So as well as collecting knowledge about foods and bush medicines, also about materials that were used. On the left here, you can see Yukokanch, which is a hibiscus tiliaceus, which is used to make spears for fishing. And why this is used to make spears, you can see that the stems are really quite straight, so they make a good spear handle, but also because it floats. So if you're fishing and you drop it, you're not going to lose your spear. Also, we went out collecting material to use to make grass skirts for ceremonies, and with my Wik First Nation mum, Kugu mum, Mavis Nalamata, we collected lots of Pandanus spiralis for making her beautiful baskets. Mavis actually became a very renowned artist after I finished my work in the field, and some of her pieces are exhibited in major galleries in Australia. So one of the interesting aspects of working with local people was understanding their sort of relationship with the plants and how they understood the plant, that there were certain plants that are calendar plants. So the bottom left is yukmok, an acacia species. And when it's in flower, you know then that it's time to collect turtle eggs. Now, the use of these calendar plants is really important because the Wick people recognise 8 seasons as opposed to the European Australian perspective of wet and dry, the 2 seasons. They recognise 8 seasons that are, you will know which season it is according to which signal is given from nature, that which will then determine what activities need to be carried out. And this way, actually, it has encoded within it sustainability, so sustainable practices. Some of the work I did as well, documenting the recording of digging up the dye plants, the Haemodorum coccineum you can see here, the top right. And these were used to make these beautiful baskets and to dye the dark baskets and dilly bags made from pandanus. You can see here, Mavis showing the sort of beginnings of a lovely basket that she wove. And in fact, there's a completed basket because of her incredible talent at making basketry and art. Mavis met the Queensland State Minister for the Arts, and she presented her basket woven from pandanus to him. Also, one of the plants that features in the book, the Ethnobotanical, is the paperbark, Yukkich tumpi, which is one of the tea trees, Melaleuca leucodendra. And historically, before the mission days, sheets of the bark were used to build wet season shelters and as a waterproof blanket. Also used to make so-called coulamons, which are cradles for carrying infants, and for lighting fires, and for wrapping food when cooked in an earth oven, which is known as a cup murray. And interestingly, if you remember my dream that I told you about, that sort of set me off on my mission to become an ethnobotanist, before the missionaries arrived in Erekun and people lived out bush, the corpses were wrapped in paper bark, and these corpses were carried around for about a year on a stretcher before there was then a cremation ceremony at the end of that time, when everyone would come together and celebrate the life. So it's quite spooky because obviously I had no idea about this in my dream. And anyway, the leaves are used to flavour fish and meat, and they have quite a lovely flavour with the food that's cooked in the earth oven. And they also have a medicinal use. So some of in some areas, especially Indonesia, essential oil sold as kajaput oil is made from the leaves of this paper bark, which is used in licensed medicines that you can buy over here in the UK. Another plant that features in the book is noni, maiku munkun, which is known as maiku munkun, which means dog food, essentially, because it was eaten by dingoes. Wild dingoes would jump up and eat the fruit. It has an incredibly strong odor, resembling really strong cheese, and quite an acquired taste from what I understand. I didn't actually try eating it myself. Certainly it was used as a famine food, but it's also used as a medicine across its distribution. So it grows a lot in Pacific Islands as well. Externally, it can be used to treat sores and inflammation, and internally it's used to treat colds and coughs, flu, etc., and also for regulating menstruation. It's in the Rubiaceae family, where a number of dye plants belong to. So the root is used to create a red or yellow dye for the Polynesia tapa, or traditional bark cloth. And it was also one of the most common canoe plants that were carried across the ocean by the Polynesian ancestors from the Polynesian islands, where the Polynesian ancestors went from island to island, and they would take the useful plants with them to each island. And this is one of those. I won't go through this for much, but it's just how local people categorize. So when you're trying to understand local people's relationship with plants, you can understand that there's actually a form of classification, but unlike in Western science, it's very contextual, and there are overlapping systems that are used. And so basic one based on utilitarian, whether it's min or mai or nyai or habit, life form. I developed the database for use in the community, the Erikun Ethnobiology database. This was a photo taken at Umban, where the story place of the Maiwati, the root is. It integrates, the database integrates the local WIC knowledge with Western, so-called Western scientific knowledge, but importantly, it gives parity to both systems. So the use of images and terms that local people, local WIC people can use, as well as those appropriate for scientists. So the taxonomic descriptions and biochemical, nutritional, and toxicity data, as well as scientific references. So this is a image of the structure of the database. You can see it's quite complex, but actually the front end is actually much easier to understand. It's actually easy to use, lots of big buttons, and you can just enter the name that you know to search by. So that was my time in Australia. Since I've been back, I've been involved with various other projects. I've been working as what I call an ethnobotanical practitioner. So it's not so much about documenting traditional use of plants, but working with different peoples to try and promote the knowledge and our understanding and interrelationships with plants. So one project I was involved with was Coed Gwencllian project with farmers from Carmarthenshire in South Wales. And you can see the farmers here. So their land is one that is imbued with folklore and history. It appears in Welsh medieval texts, and has been also associated with the mining industries, mining and ironworks. And we walked across the landscape, collaborated on this project with an artist, and we were looking at the plants that we encountered and to try and understand their narratives, understand their stories. Why did they get there? Why are they there? What are the, have they been used? What were their story? How were they intertwined with people's use of them in the past? So the farmers here are Kate and Ilktud Dunsford from their farm in Carmarthenshire near Pontiats. And it was very much an interdisciplinary project. So we investigated the different plants and their stories. So we found several medicinal plants growing there. St. John's wort, which is used to treat low mood or mild depression. Meadowsweet, which contains salicylic acid, similar to aspirin or similar to willow bark. And interestingly, evening primrose was growing wild. It was naturalized on the farm. And we were quite intrigued. Kate was quite intrigued. She said she thought it was rather a blousy plant that seemed somehow out of place. It is. It's a North American plant that was introduced in the 17th century to British Isles because of the colonial trade. It was introduced, presumably brought back to Europe because of its ornamental value. But it was soon discovered, because of its Native American uses, that it actually had many medicinal uses. So it's used traditionally by various Native American tribes, such as the Iroquois, Cherokee, and many others. It has many uses today, used in traditional herbal medicine, even in the UK, what's so-called traditional, used to treat, regulate menstruation, menopause, the seeds, the oil seed in particular is used. Oh, there we go. I've got another picture here of it. It became a very popular remedy in the 17th century and was given the nickname King's Cure-all. As I said before, it's actually cultivated today for its oil. So many plants are actually migrate with people. So we find that throughout history, those plants that have a useful value to people in particular are those which maybe get transported when people migrate. So St. John's wort was actually brought to North America, where unfortunately it's become a so-called noxious invasive weed, more of which, because the next slide, this slide here, shows that on the farm there were huge stands of Himalayan balsam, Impatiens glandulifera, which is considered an invasive alien plant of concern. It's I think it's called a Schedule 9 plant. So landowners really have a duty to try and eradicate it and remove it from the land. It's very difficult because the seeds get transported down the waterways, the local rivers. And it's trying to understand. So when we looked at this plant, we were really looking, well, what is the story behind this Himalayan balsam? Why did it end up here in particular? So it was actually introduced to Europe in 1839 from seeds sent to the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew by Dr. Royal from Kashmir. It naturalized quite quickly, became widespread, especially along waterways and the rivers that are associated with industry. And it has been very successful in colonizing post-industrial polluted landscapes, of which the farm is here because they had soil analysis undertaken. They found it's very high in heavy metals, presumably as a result of the mining industries that went on earlier. It didn't close down till last century. So one of the interesting stories about this plant is that it hyperaccumulates cadmium. It's actually very heavy metal tolerant. So actually, we can look at it in another way. Instead of seeing it as a noxious invasive weed, which it can be considered certainly because it outcompetes local species. One of the reasons why it outcompetes the other species is because of its tolerance to heavy metals. So we could look at it another way, and that actually it's performing a role to clean up the environment, to transform the environment, to fight a remediation role. And at the talk last week, somebody said, well, maybe we can use the plant to extract cadmium from the plant if it hyperaccumulates it, because cadmium obviously is quite a valuable metal. So maybe there is another role for the plant in that respect. But also you can see here the bees loved it. It actually performs quite interesting environmental role, and it certainly is a transformative agent of the land and is cleaning the land of the harmful heavy metals that resulted from human activity. Another little project I was involved with students at Oxford is I ran an exploratory workshop to see how we can see and sense trees, sort of look at trees as being sentient beings. We can maybe reconnect with them in a different way and facilitate our reconnection with the natural world around us. And it was really interesting, actually, this workshop, because we had people from different cultural backgrounds from among the Oxford students, and some of them had different attitudes about trees. Certainly there's one student said that really you shouldn't approach a tree at night time because you might wake it up, which was really quite a lovely story. So understanding all these interlinks and the stories around dryads and tree spirits is, I think, is a fascinating one. It's really important that we promote the plant knowledge and our engagement, emotional attachment to plants within our own culture. And I see that as the role of ethnobotanical practitioners today, because this loss of knowledge around plants isn't just located within First Nations communities in Northern Australia, but it's a global phenomenon due to many factors such as urbanisation, the disconnect from the natural world around us through being, looking on screens, and maybe the education system doesn't teach enough of natural history. So it's really important that we do promote this knowledge of plants. The only way really to protect and love plants is to know them. So one of these methods is using play and creative methods. So the photo on the left was taken at a festival at Kew some years ago when I was back working there. And the one on the right is at Oxford Botanic Garden with my own two daughters, showing them the squirting cucumber. I also work with London Borough of Richmond's Arts Service, which is a brilliant project, and the Cultural Reforesting Programme, which is a series of artist-led multidisciplinary projects and set in the ecological crises. And we actually, the artist project was all about responding to the question, how can we renew our relationship with nature? So we worked with various school groups across the borough. I also worked with young people in the care system, which was incredibly rewarding, using art, using story, spoken word, artists as well was involved. So it was really about helping engage the young people with the plants around them to engender a love for the natural world. There's the photo taken with one of the school groups through Orleans House Gallery, and really, really rewarding work. More recently, I've been collaborating with Chris Thorogood, my line manager and deputy director of Oxford Botanic Garden, as well as colleagues in Southeast Asia, on protecting this amazing Rafflesia plant, which is it is the world's largest flower and really interesting plant, and really critically endangered. Most of the species that belong to Rafflesia are critically endangered. So this is where it's really important that we understand, support the work of indigenous communities like the Banyao, who are the chief protectors of Rafflesia in the Philippines. And these are some of the beautiful artwork, that Chris did. He's also a talented artist as well as being a botanist. This was the paper that we produced, and it was really talking as well as how do we address this risk of threat and how can we overcome it, how scientific techniques can help support the indigenous communities using sort of tissue culture, etc. So finally, I'll just finish off now what I think ethnobotany, why I think ethnobotany is important in bridging knowledges and is able to help address ecological challenges. By understanding traditional ecological knowledge, which is accumulated over generations, ethnobotany provides insights into sustainable resource management, conservation practices, and also adaptation strategies, which are crucial for creating ecological resilience. Biodiversity conservation is also an important aspect of ethnobotanical work, especially working with indigenous and local communities who have intricate knowledge about the biodiversity in their environment. And we can contribute as ethnobotanists to the identification and conservation of plant species. And also, we can also learn, as scientists can learn from indigenous practices, which show how to sustainably harvest various plants. It can help inform conservation. Medicinal plants are also really important. Many pharmaceutical drugs have their origins in traditional medicine, and ethnobotany can identify potential leads for drug discovery, possibly reducing pressure on wild populations and promoting the conservation. And it's also important that ethnobotany emphasizes the cultural significance of plants, their role in ceremonies and identity, and it's important to acknowledge and respect the cultural connections, and it allow conservation efforts to be more inclusive and culturally sensitive. Community engagement is also really important. Ethnobotany encourages collaboration, engagement with local communities, and involving local communities on an equal level in this ecological research conservation initiatives help promote a sense of ownership and responsibility. And it's important to use these participatory approaches, which could lead to effective solutions that align with the needs and aspirations of people that are directly affected by ecological challenges. And also, as an interdisciplinary collaboration, ethnobotany can provide holistic insights and innovative solutions. So I just want to say thank you all to listening. Sorry this isn't the same as the talk that I gave last week. I hope I've not gabbled too much, but I want to say thank you to listening if you've got this far, and also to acknowledge all my colleagues, past and present, including from Erekun, Balcony Cape York Development Corporation, Kew, Parks Wildlife Commission, Quercus Books, UCL School of Pharmacy, London Borough of Richmond, I forgot to put here, University Federal de Ceará and University of Oxford. And especially want to acknowledge my family, including my Tiwi and Wick family members, especially those who have now departed, and my various funders, including British Airways under their Assisting Conservation Scheme, Bentham Oxon Trust, British Ecological Society, NERC, London Borough Pharmacy, Richmond Borough Council, Thriplow Trust, to name a few. I probably missed some off there. Finally, I just want to say thank you most of all to my dad, the songman, my Peep father. And when I learnt that he passed away 6 months after my return from the field, and I wrote a song for him, and the words of which were read out at his funeral. And some of the words are in Wick Munken, or Aboriginal English, so I've provided some definitions here so you know what I'm talking about. I'm now going to recite to say thank you for Peep, Song for the Songman. You sang the old songs, now this song is for you. I'm far away in another land, but these words are true. You showed me Alkmin, birds, flowers and trees, min korra, broga, mayat, sugar bag from bees. You showed me opera for when you're ill, and bush tucker for dilly bags to fill. My court, beautiful lily, grows in the lagoon. Let's dance this night under the moon. Shake a leg as the clapsticks go clack, 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 and paint yourself in woo, for in my heart forever, I'll always remember you. Watch out for that pickle. See his tracks in the sand? He's a big fella, all right. Come, take my hand. And we walk and we talk of tales from the bush, of hunting with ghosts and giant birds from long ago, dreaming sacred stories that touch my very soul. And the con is laughing in the tree. Don't be sad, for I am free. I'm at home now in my own country. Thank you.